Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcasts, where we interview diverse innovators and creative change makers. I'm Deborah Levine, the editor-in-chief of the American Diversity Report, and your host today. And our guest today is Deepa Purushothaman. She is the co-founder of Information, which provides brave, safe, new space professional women of color, and a woman and public policy program leader in practice at the Harvard Kennedy School. Prior to this, Deepa spent more than 20 years at Deloitte and was the first Indian American woman to make partner in the company's history. Go you, Deepa. And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you got involved in the career that obviously you have made a very outstanding success of.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say, sometimes it doesn't feel like that. I think we all look at other people's careers and right, suggest those things. And I think for yourself, a lot of us are still figuring it out. But I, went to Deloitte after grad school. I thought I wanted a year or two of private sector experience. My background had been politics. And so I always thought I would be working on policy and politics. And I ended up at Deloitte and had a magical career. I moved so quickly through, the operations and practice. I became partner pretty young and, like you said, was the first. And there were a lot of opportunities that come with being a first, in addition to the fact that I was good at what I did, which I have to remind people sometimes. But so I had that great career. And then towards the latter stages of my career, I started to ask different questions around purpose. I started to get sick. And so there was a really growing health question for me. And a lot of what I did entailed traveling. And so there were some questions for me on like, is this the job that I can continue doing? I have at least 20 more years, in front of me. Is it practical for where I am in my life? And so I started to ask those questions in real earnest. And I found myself really struggling because as a first, I think, we look at first, or we look at trailblazers and we think, they've had these magical careers. We don't often talk about the shadow side of trailblazing. Like it's hard. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of eyes on you. And as a first, I felt really responsible to stay in my seat, right? Like I felt like if I quit, it would reflect badly on me, but also on the other women of color coming up around me or behind me. And so I started gathering women of color to figure out what to do. It started as one-on-one, and over time, it ended up becoming basically a dozen dinners across the country with 20 or 30 women of color each. I did that with my now business partner, who was my coach then, Ra. And we would get in these rooms, Deborah, I thought for an hour or two, I'm just networking. I'm just trying to figure out, like after 20 years in one career, where does someone go? And instead, we would be there for 6, 7, 8 hours talking about what it was like to be an only in these spaces, right? All of the women had faced these experiences of navigating, of questioning their imposter syndrome, of, getting to the seat, feeling like there was a lot of pressure and to be perfect and all of the things that we can unpack. But it was shared across the board. And so those conversations really became fodder for the book that I wrote, but also for the company that I founded. And so I don't know that it was all that thoughtful. I think, I had this really important, great career that I loved for a really long time. I had a big role at Deloitte. I was head of our Women's Initiative, which is also a very well-known program. So it's always work that I've liked and cared about. But I think that the real focus on women of color came as a result of my own sort of searching, to be honest with you.
Wow. Maybe it doesn't surprise you but some of this sounds real familiar.
Okay.
Yes, as an executive director of an organization, and I had to leave because of my health, and then wondered what should I do, and I gathered the women together in something I called Women's Council on Diversity. And it launched the next 20 years, most creative time of my life.
Oh, I literally have chills as you're saying that, because I feel like I'm still figuring it out. I should say I only left a year and a half ago, so it's all relatively new to me. A lot has happened quickly because I left right at the time of George Floyd's murder. And so I left maybe 6 weeks before, and our whole conversation on race in the workplace changed right around that time, I feel like. And so I also just happened to pick something that I knew I wanted to work on that also became one of the topics of our moment, right? Or I'm sorry, one of the moments that, one of the biggest things we're talking about in in America right now. And so it was not as planned as maybe it looks like from the outside. So I love hearing that you have a similar path. I hope to follow and to have impact in the same way. So
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that happens is that you have all the skill set from
yes.
your time at Deloitte, but then you have now the opportunity to apply it in all sorts of different ways
Yeah,
that you
I
might not
think you're
have been
right.
able to do before.
Yeah.
And that's so much what women are so excellent at, are they
Yes.
not?
Yes. I think that's true. It's interesting when you sit in a corporate seat or you sit in one company for a long time, I think you forget that. And I met so many senior women who forget that, right? Who forget that they get to take their skills with them. There's a chapter in the book that I wrote that talks about stay or go, where I interviewed some really well-known entrepreneurs. And that's actually one of their pieces of advice, is that you all forget when you sit in a seat for so long within a company that you get to take your skills with you. And I think what's amazing for me is if I ever went back to corporate or back to that sort of job again, I don't think I will, but if I ever did, I have the most amazing network across America, probably globally at this point, of all these women who are sitting in power seats that I didn't have when I was in my previous role, just as a result of having these discussions. So I think you're right. I think we are maybe good at networking, but only when we have to. I would probably say I was just busy. I was heads down. Part of what I realized, at the time that I got sick, is that I was really lonely. I didn't have other women of color and other women friends, because as a first and only, you're just working. I was just trying to stay in the seat. I was trying to make sure I did well. I was trying to make sure I excelled. And I just kind of sacrificed, I think, some of the personal things that I think, to your point, that we need to be healthy and happy, including community, which is why so much of my work now is about community.
Yeah, I love it. Yes,
Mhm.
thank you. And we talk about the corporate world, and that women are making headway, is
Yep.
true, right? But there isn't the best structure there for women to do so, especially women of color. Is that pretty much the case?
Yeah, I mean, the data suggests that, yes, women and women of color are progressing, but at really slow rates. And it's a challenge. And what we find is, and this is true for women and women of color, it's usually at the manager level that you start to see the first kind of leakage, right? Because that's when you have to manage others. It's also when I think a lot of us are facing the pressures of family, right? Many of us get married, having children around that time and age, those things come together. And then we also see real challenges at the senior level. If there's another mass exodus, especially for women of color at the more senior levels. And I think a lot of that has to do with the things that I have really uncovered and I think are different for women of color than maybe women, right? It's more of the stereotypes. It's really more of the, again, being an only and having to really fight some of that. It's really feeling like, in a lot of ways, a lot of the women I interviewed felt like the cultures didn't work for them. And so a lot of them ended up opting out at really senior levels, maybe right before the C-suite, to go build their own companies, right, with their own cultures, because they just didn't want to do it anymore. So I do think there are points that are probably very similar for all women, but I think there are some really top points for women of color in particular.
Mm. Your conversations with women of color must have been fascinating,
Yes.
about what they were experiencing and how they saw it.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's so many nuggets that I walked away with, right? So one being, I think a lot of us make up, and I'm sure this, I'd be curious, I think this is probably true for women too, but many of us edit ourselves, right? We think that we have to be a certain way to rise, that leadership looks like a certain thing. It's not, doesn't look like me at all, for sure. And so there were messages consciously and unconsciously that I had, and that I would continue to tell myself. But what I found with the women I interviewed is that almost all of them had told themselves, once I get to the top levels, then I'll do it my way. And the challenge is, once they got there, there was more pressure to do it like everybody else, right? And even to toe the line. And so that was kind of an erroneous belief. I think the other thing that I found that was really surprising, and I, by the way, I think this is true for all workers, right? Not just for women of color in this moment, is that 2 out of 3 women of color I interviewed were actually sick with what I call a mysterious illness. So not like, a diagnosis like cancer or something that's clear, but stomach pains, headaches, migraines, skin rashes, fertility issues, adrenal fatigue, almost everybody. And so I think there is something that happens in these pressure-filled situations where we're conforming, performing, producing at a cost of our health and our well-being that is, I do think, a little bit different for women of color, because there's, again, fewer of us and we feel like there's more pressure, and we almost have to overprove ourselves to kind of stay in the situations that we're in.
Wow. Yes, I experienced that even at age 16 when I was had just been accepted into Harvard.
Okay.
Excuse me, Radcliffe. It had
Okay.
not combined with Harvard yet.
Okay.
Did that while I was there. And that combination, that attempt to accommodate,
Mhm.
it was not a smooth process by any
Correct.
means. It was highly tense in many ways.
Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
what we're experiencing in the corporate world.
That is absolutely what we're experiencing. But I think it's almost, I mean, I'd be curious if this was your experience, but I think what's almost different in the corporate world is we brainwash people, or we tell people it's not like that, right? We like parade around this idea that it's going to be a meritocracy, that as long as perform well, you'll be okay, and you can be yourself, and you can be happy, you can say what you want. We say all these things, and that's not actually how it is. A lot of company cultures do really restrict what is acceptable and what we think of leadership as and how we advance people. It's actually a very narrow line that I think we don't have permission to be ourselves. And again, I'm not trying to get us to be our full selves all the time. I don't think that sort of advice is helpful, but I want us to be more conscious of how much we edit ourselves and how much that conforming behavior is part of these structures that we navigate. Because I think as women and women of color, we've been told it doesn't happen, right? It's not happening to us. And so many of us end up unhealthy or lonely or confused, looking back saying, what just happened, right? And 10 years ago when we started doing it, right? And so it's interesting that you shared that.
Yeah, it was a while ago before this conversation could even have
Yeah.
have taken place,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think we have grown to a certain point where we can have this conversation.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that the changes come very quickly or easily.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. This work is hard and it's going to take a long time. And, I get asked often, like, what are the 3 things I can do, or how quickly can I? It's not that kind of work. And we were just beginning to have the conversations. I feel like we're just beginning to find the vocabulary to even have some of the discussions. A lot of companies feel like they have created safe spaces for open dialogue. I'll go into a company and a CEO, usually a white male CEO, will say, like, my employees tell me how it is, right? My Black and brown employees will tell me. And I'll go meet those same Black and brown employees, and I hear a whole different set of stories, because I just don't think we've created a place, a space where it is, one, safe to tell your truth, where you're rewarded for telling your truth. And there's even a benefit, I think, in some ways, right, for telling your truth.
indeed, what do you think should happen? What should these CEOs be paying attention to and change?
Yeah, I think we have to really recognize that we don't always know what the work is, and we're still unpacking what has to change. I think the other thing is really listening in a very different way. Is it's partly making space for the conversations, but understanding that cultures, again, aren't just because you say you're holding safe space doesn't mean that's truly safe. And so finding other ways to do that, maybe bringing in outside people to have some of the conversation. I've been doing a lot with the book launch where I am speaking to companies, usually, a small group of like, it's usually ERG led or maybe HR led, where I come in and I talk about what's different for women of color. And then employees can kind of share their truth. It's almost like I call it balloon popping, but I've kind of started with telling the truth. So it's easier for others to do that. I think it's sometimes hard to be the first. And so being creative about how you create those spaces and begin the conversation is what I'd advise CEOs.
Excellent, excellent. I'm taking notes. It's amazing to me that those of us who have gone through these times have become the creative entrepreneurs, can then go back and assist other people to be creative and innovative, perhaps within the corporate space.
Yes. Yeah, I talk about that a little bit. Someone asked me early on when I was writing the book, my agent actually is a really well-known agent. He said, "You're not trying to tell everybody to leave corporate America, are you?" And I said, "No, that's not the advice. I want you to leave if it's not working and it's really, truly, a detriment to you or hurting your health. And it's okay to leave, because I think a lot of women of color stay in situations longer than we should, because we're taught to be grateful and thankful. And, just the security is so important from some of the cultures we come from. But I also think we have to have space to really do things differently, and even in companies, find ways to speak up. So one of the women I work with calls it entrepreneurship, right? And kind of really finding ways to make change within companies. And I think we need both. But I also think we need to really listen to ourselves so that we're only staying in situations where we can be healthy, right? Where we can make change, where we can be in full voice. Because otherwise, you end up sick. You end up with all the, all the things we started with. So
That's right. That's right. And with COVID, it's clearer than ever. What we need is the support
yeah.
and the health awareness more than ever.
Absolutely. I think that's what's been interesting. So I wrote the book again for women of color, thinking I was writing it for a very specific group. And so many others have picked up the book as a result of where we are in the life of COVID, right?
Yeah.
So many people are questioning the space that they want work to take in their lives. And in some ways, that's what this book is questioning. It's questioning what are the sacrifices you're willing to make? What are the things you're not willing to sacrifice? And at its core, like, does work for everybody right now? Is work working for anybody? Maybe that's a better question right now. I think that's what it's really asking.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We are in very interesting times, as they say, better or worse.
Yeah.
And they're probably going to get a lot more interesting now that the international situation is so challenging. And I can't even imagine how people are going to react to that, how these women are going to go forward.
Yeah. I think I believe we're in a moment where it's exciting and a lot of things are possible, but we also have the old guard in a lot of places, right? Like the old ways of like systems working, the old ways things were done. And I kind of feel like we're in this moment. I'm going to get a little new agey, but like for us to kind of get to the new world and the new beliefs and the new values and the new way of working, it's almost like we have to go through that transition period. And that's what this time feels like. I keep telling women it feels powerful if we can step through it. It does feel like a moment where change is possible in a way that I have never felt before. I feel like we're coming together, we're having conversations we've never had before, and we all are saying, yes, it's not working, let's do something. But I think a lot will be said in the next few years if we actually are able to change it and hold true to that and don't kind of revert back to how it used to be.
Yeah. So what kind of advice do you have for women?
My advice is really, it's about finding your own power. So I call it the power of me, and then finding the power of we. So it's really about finding your own values and what matters to you and what your boundaries are and who you want to be. And there's so many things we're told from our parents and from our schools and from our professors and from society that really influence what we think is possible for ourselves. So for me, the me work is really figuring out on all these things, what matters to you, what really is success for you, what is leadership for you, what makes you happy. That's the me work. I think once you are clear in the me work, then you can find the we, right? The power of we, which is finding each other, because I don't believe we can change systems without working together, without talking about these things. I think it's really hard to navigate without our sisters, like in those dinners, to actually understand that what was happening to me is happening to others. And so I think that's power there. This is not in the book that I wrote, but it's new as I talk with more and more allies who I call co-conspirators. I feel like part of what we also need is the power of us, right? Because this is not just work women of color can do by themselves. We didn't create the system. We need to all work together to change it. And that's where I think everybody has to work together.
Wonderful, wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't covered yet?
No, I mean, I think where this is a really special moment, and we touched on it. I hope that people really step through it. I hope we have the hard conversations. I hope we, don't shy away from topics of race and diversity and inclusion because they're hard. Workplaces are one of the only places, actually, data suggests, where we actually interact with people who are different than us from a racial and ethnic background. It's actually not happening where we live, is what the data across the country shows. So if work is one of the only places where you can engage with someone who is different than you, like, that's where we have to have the conversations. So I just really want us to be braver, I guess, is my hope for all of us.
Wonderful. Remind us again the name of your book.
Yes, it's called The First, The Few, The Only: How Women of Color Can Reimagine Power in Corporate America. And you can find it, everywhere books are sold. So it's out now.
Congratulations on it. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, for audience, for tuning in. I know you're going to enjoy this one, and we'll see you soon again. In the meantime, Deepa, stay online while we sign off. And thank you again. And I look forward to maybe talking again later in the year to see how things are going for you.
I would love that. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you.